Pull up Matthew chapter 2. Not the whole book, just chapter 2, the Nativity story as Matthew tells it. Now pull up Luke chapter 2, the Nativity story as Luke tells it. Put them side by side if you can, on a screen, on your phone, in a Bible with two fingers marking two pages. Read them both, not one after the other, at the same time. The way you would read two witness statements before deciding what you believe about what they witnessed. I need to tell you what I found when I finally did that. I have to be honest about how long it took me to do something that simple. I spent most of my adult life assuming, without ever actually checking, that Matthew and Luke were telling the same story from different angles. The way two reporters might cover the same event and notice different things. The manger and the shepherds and the wise men and the star and the angels singing in the night air above the fields. I assumed all of that was in both accounts, woven together by faithful tradition into the one complete picture. That picture is on the cards, on the yard decorations, on the front of the church bulletins I handed out as a deacon for 22 years at a Southern Baptist church in Knoxville, Tennessee. I had never sat down with both Gospels open at the same time to check. On a Thursday afternoon in November, I was maybe 3 years into this, spending time at the library most weeks, working through questions that had started small and were no longer small. I pushed two tables together and put both accounts in front of me at once. What I found was not what I expected. I expected minor differences, the kind of variation that is normal in historical testimony, where one person notices something the other did not, where the emphasis shifts but the facts align. That is how honest witnesses work. They describe the same event from their own vantage point, and you can feel the edges match even when the details differ. What I found instead were 4 places where the two accounts cannot both be historically true. Not 4 places where they see things differently. 4 places where, if one account is right about a specific fact, the other account is wrong about that same fact. Not emphasis, not angle. The same fact, 2 incompatible claims. Raymond E. Brown, a Catholic priest, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, the scholar who spent more time on these 2 nativity accounts than perhaps anyone in the 20th century, described their relationship in a book he published in 1977, The Birth of the Messiah, 750 pages, the standard work, used in theological universities around the world. His conclusion was precise. The 2 narratives are not only different, they are contrary to each other in a number of details. Not different, contrary. A man who loved these texts, who devoted his academic life to them, who was a Catholic priest and had no interest in destabilizing what he studied. He read them carefully and he used that word. I want to show you why. Matthew chapter 1 begins with a genealogy. We will come back to that. Chapter 2 begins with the arrival of a group of men from the east. They come to Jerusalem asking where they can find the King of the Jews because they have seen his star rise. Herod the Great, King of Judea, an Idumean appointed by Rome, a man capable of extraordinary violence and equally extraordinary construction, hears this and convenes a meeting of his chief priests and scribes. He asks where the Messiah is to be born. They quote him from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Bethlehem. The prophet had named the city. Herod sends the visitors south to Bethlehem and asks them to report back when they find the child. Now, read carefully. The visitors follow the star to Bethlehem. They find the child in, not a manger, not a stable. Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. They enter a house. The Greek word is oikia, a residence, a place where a family lives. Joseph and Mary are not travelers who arrived the night before. They are residents. Bethlehem is where they live. The visitors themselves are called Magi in the Greek text. Magoi, court astrologers from the east, probably Persian. The text does not call them kings. The text does not count them. 3 gifts are mentioned: gold, frankincense, myrrh, and tradition invented 3 men to carry 3 gifts, but Matthew does not count them. They are astronomers, and they arrived not on the night of the birth, but sometime afterward, because Herod's later order to kill male children 2 years old and under tells us he calculated the star's appearance at up to 2 years before. The child may be walking by the time they knock on the door. Herod realizes the Magi are not returning with a report. He issues the order. Kill all male children in the region of Bethlehem, 2 years old and under. Matthew calls this event the massacre of the innocents. He frames it with Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. But before the soldiers arrive, Joseph is warned in a dream. He takes the child and Mary and flees to Egypt. They stay there until Herod dies. Matthew quotes Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I called my son. Herod dies. The family starts home, but Joseph hears that Herod's son Archelaus is now ruling Judea. He is afraid. Warned again in a dream, he takes the family away from Judea entirely, to the region of Galilee. They settle in a city called Nazareth. In Matthew's account, Nazareth is a new start, a different place. The family had never lived there before. They went there because they could not safely go home to Bethlehem. Now I want you to notice what Matthew does not have. No census, no decree from Caesar Augustus, no journey from Galilee to Judea because of a registration, no inn, no manger, no shepherds in the fields outside the city, no angels announcing the birth to people nearby. Not one element of the pastoral scene that fills every church in December appears in Matthew's account. Not one. Now Luke. Luke chapter 2 opens with a decree. Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, ruler of the Mediterranean world, has ordered that all the world be registered, a census. The registration is to be conducted under the authority of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. This is why Joseph goes to Bethlehem, not because he lives there, because he is of the house and lineage of David, and Bethlehem is the city of David, and the Roman bureaucracy requires everyone to be registered in their ancestral town. So Joseph and Mary, she is already far along in her pregnancy, traveled from Nazareth in Galilee southward through the Jordan Valley, up into the hill country of Judea, roughly 90 miles on foot, or maybe on the back of an animal if they had one. They arrive in Bethlehem. There is no room for them in the Cataluma, the inn or guest room. She gives birth. She wraps the baby in cloth. She lays him in a manger, a feeding trough for animals, because there was nowhere else. That same night in the fields outside Bethlehem, shepherds are keeping watch over their flocks. An angel appears. The text says the glory of the Lord shone around them, and the shepherds were terrified. The angel announces the birth. Today, in the city of David, a Savior has been born. A great company of angels appears, singing. The shepherds go into Bethlehem and find the family exactly as described. They tell everyone they meet. They return to their flocks, praising God. 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised. 40 days after the birth, in accordance with Leviticus chapter 12, Mary comes to Jerusalem to make her purification offering at the temple. 2 turtle doves. An old man named Simeon recognizes the child and holds him and says, he can die now because his eyes have seen what he was waiting to see. A prophetess named Anna gives thanks. Then, and I want you to hear this carefully, Luke chapter 2, verse 39. And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. Their own town, home, the place they came from. 40 days after the birth, the family goes straight back to Nazareth. In Luke's account, no Herod, no Magi, no star observed by astrologers in distant courts, no massacre of infants, no flight to Egypt, no cautious return after a tyrant's death, no house in Bethlehem. They are visitors in a city that is not theirs, passing through because of a census, returning home afterward. The manger belongs to Luke. The shepherds belong to Luke. The angels singing over the fields belong to Luke. The Magi belong to Matthew. The star belongs to Matthew. The massacre belongs to Matthew. Egypt belongs to Matthew. Not one of those elements crosses from one account to the other. Now I need to bring the history teacher in me into this, because there is a problem here that goes beyond what you see in the narratives. It is a chronological problem, and it is not the kind of problem you resolve by saying 2 authors noticed different things. Matthew fixes the date of the birth with one specific fact. Herod the Great is the reigning king. The entire structure of Matthew's nativity, the Magi going to Herod, Herod consulting his advisors, Herod issuing the order to kill the children, requires Herod to be alive. Without Herod, Matthew's story has no engine. When did Herod the Great die? Josephus recorded it. Flavius Josephus was a first-century Jewish historian who became a Roman citizen and who had direct access to Roman administrative records and to the oral traditions of the Jewish aristocracy. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 17, Chapter 8, he describes Herod's final illness in considerable detail, including the lunar eclipse that occurred near the end of Herod's life and the Passover festival that followed shortly after Herod's death. Historians and astronomers have calculated that eclipse. It occurred on the night of March 12th to 13th in 4 BC. The Passover of that year fell in early April. Herod the Great died between those two events, in the spring of 4 BC. If Matthew's nativity requires Herod to be alive, Jesus was born before 4 BC. Luke fixes the date of the birth with one specific fact: the census of Quirinius. Caesar Augustus orders the registration. Quirinius is governor of Syria. Joseph travels to Bethlehem because of this census. Without the census of Quirinius, Luke's family has no reason to make the journey. The manger doesn't exist, the shepherds have no one to find. When was Quirinius governor of Syria conducting a census? Josephus recorded that too. In Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 1, Josephus describes the arrival of Quirinius in Syria as governor with specific authority to conduct a census of Judea's property. He records that the census provoked a significant revolt, led by a man named Judas of Galilee, whose followers refused to register. Josephus covers this in detail because it was a politically important event. It happened in 6 and 7 AD. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. The census of Quirinius was conducted in 6 and 7 AD. The minimum gap between those two dates is 10 years. Some calculations put it at 12. Jesus cannot have been born both during the reign of Herod the Great and during the census of Quirinius. The two dates are a decade apart. One of the authors is wrong about the historical context, or both are, or neither of them was primarily interested in giving us a historically accurate date to place on a timeline. I spent 35 years as a history teacher. I know what it means when two sources covering the same event give you incompatible dates. Not dates that differ by a year or two, where calendar systems or copyist errors might explain the gap. Dates that differ by a decade, fixed to specific historical events that external sources confirm. The apologists have tried to resolve this. Arguments about an earlier administrative role for Quirinius. Arguments about what Luke means by first registration. I have read them carefully. But Josephus records no census of Judea under Quirinius before 6 AD. No Roman inscription, no imperial papyrus, no administrative record has ever surfaced to document it. The evidence points in one direction. Two authors place the birth of Jesus a decade apart from each other. Not a different angle on the same historical moment. A different historical moment. Now here is the question I did not know to ask for most of my life. Why does it matter where Jesus was born? The answer is one verse, Micah chapter 5 verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. That is the messianic birthplace prophecy. Any Jewish writer in the 1st century who wanted to argue that Jesus was the Messiah had a problem that was sitting right there in plain sight. Jesus was from Nazareth. Everyone knew this. He is called Jesus of Nazareth 17 times in the New Testament. The inscription Pilate ordered, placed above the cross in John's account, reads, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, not Jesus of Bethlehem. Nazareth, a fishing village region in the north, associated with mixed populations and working people, not with the royal heritage of David's Judean tribe. Micah said the ruler would come from Bethlehem. Jesus came from Nazareth. Every community writing in the decades after his death, developing the theology of who he was, faced the same problem. They needed him in Bethlehem. Micah required it. Matthew solved it one way. Put the family there from the beginning. Joseph and Mary are residents of Bethlehem. Jesus is born at home. After the danger from Herod forces them to flee and they cannot safely return, they relocate to Galilee and settle in Nazareth, a new start, a safe city, a place where Archelaus's reach did not extend. Luke solved it a different way. Bring the family there by necessity. They live in Nazareth. A Roman census requires Joseph to register in his ancestral city. Jesus happens to be born during the journey. Then the family goes home. Two solutions to the same theological problem. Both put Jesus in Bethlehem for his birth. Both fulfill Micah chapter 5. Both arrive at the required destination. By completely different routes, with incompatible details, from incompatible starting points. Raymond Brown concluded that Matthew and Luke were above all theologians, not historians. They were writing in the 80s and 90s AD, 50 to 60 years after the events they described, for communities with specific theological needs. Their nativity accounts are not independent eyewitness reports. They are carefully constructed theological narratives about who Jesus was, reaching back into the prophetic texts of Israel to establish his identity as the fulfillment of its ancient hope. There is one more thing I want to show you, and I think it is the clearest illustration of what we are dealing with. Open Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy that opens the book. 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, arranged in 3 groups of 14. Abraham to David, 14 generations. David to the Babylonian exile, 14 generations. From the exile to Jesus, 14. The structure is deliberate. In Hebrew gematria, the numerical value of the letters in David's name adds up to 14. Matthew is building a genealogy whose very arithmetic demonstrates that Jesus is the culmination of Israel's entire story. Now open Luke chapter 3. Another genealogy appears there too, but running in the opposite direction, not forward from Abraham, but backward from Jesus all the way to Adam, and through Adam to God himself. 77 generations, not 42. 77. Both genealogies trace the ancestry of Joseph, Jesus' legal father. Both are working toward the same point. Between King David and Jesus, they trace the same lineage, generation by generation, through 2 completely different sets of names. Let me be specific. In Matthew, the heir in David's royal line is Solomon, then a succession of kings of Judah, then generations leading eventually to Jacob, father of Joseph. In Luke, the son of David in the line is not Solomon. It is Nathan, a different son of David, a different branch entirely. Then a list of names running through the same generations, names that almost never match Matthew's list. 2 or 3 names appear in both, but the vast majority are entirely different. The 2 lists run alongside each other through 28 generations without matching. Both end at Joseph. 2 different men named Joseph cannot both be the biological son of 2 different men, one named Jacob, one named Heli. If Matthew's Joseph has a father named Jacob, and Luke's Joseph has a father named Heli, these are not the same lineage with minor variation. These are 2 separately constructed family trees, built from different traditions, arriving at the same destination by routes that do not intersect. My brother was visiting at Christmas one year. He drives down from Louisville every other year or so, stays a few days, the kind of visit that has its own comfortable rhythm after decades. He found me at this desk one afternoon with both genealogies printed out side by side on 2 sheets of paper. He stood in the doorway and looked at what I was doing for a moment, then walked over and looked at the 2 columns of names. I showed him where Matthew's line goes through Solomon and Luke's goes through Nathan. I showed him the point where the names diverge after David and run in parallel for nearly 30 generations without matching. He stood there, reading it quietly. Then he looked up and said, "Howard, does it really matter?" He asked it honestly, without impatience. The question of a man who has decided that the foundations are solid and that investigating what the foundations are made of is not something he needs to do. I understood the question. I had asked it myself in a different way for most of my life. But I sat with it for a long time after he went back to the living room. What I eventually arrived at was this: it matters not because the genealogies tell us who Jesus' biological ancestors were. Neither of them does, and I am fairly certain that was not their primary purpose. It matters because the divergence is visible. Any person who opens both accounts and reads them together can see with their own eyes that these 2 texts were constructed differently, from different traditions, by writers working toward compatible theological conclusions, by incompatible historical methods. Once you see that, you know what kind of text you are reading, And once you know what kind of text you are reading, you can read it properly, for what it is, not for what we were told it was. This is where I want to bring in Spinoza. Not as a weapon to take down what you believe, but because the method he described in 1670 in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the book he published without his name and without the real city of publication, because the previous man who had written something like it had been found dead in a canal. That method is what finally allowed me to stop being confused by Matthew and Luke and start actually understanding them. Spinoza's principle is simple enough to write on a note card. When you encounter a text, ask 4 questions before you decide what it means. Who wrote it? When? For whom? With what purpose? Apply those questions to Matthew. Matthew was almost certainly writing for a Jewish Christian community in the 80s or 90s AD. His audience knew the Hebrew scriptures deeply. They knew the prophets, they knew the promises, and they needed to understand how Jesus, whom they believed had been raised from the dead, related to the Israel they had grown up in. Every element of Matthew's nativity connects to a specific prophetic text, and Matthew cites each one explicitly in his signature formula. This was to fulfill what was written by the prophet. Bethlehem, Micah chapter 5. Egypt, Hosea chapter 11. The massacre of the children, Jeremiah chapter 31. Matthew maps the story of Jesus' birth onto the map of Israel's prophecies, point by point. The prophetic framework is not decoration. It is the architecture. Now apply those questions to Luke. Luke was writing for a different audience. His prologue addresses a patron named Theophilus, a Greek name. His community was likely Gentile or mixed Jewish and Gentile in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world. So Luke sets the birth against the widest possible frame, Caesar Augustus, whose decrees went out to all the world. Into that world, with its imperial census and its crowded towns and its mangers where there was no room, the one Luke believed would be greater than any emperor was born. The announcement goes not to foreign astronomers tracking stars at a distance, but to Jewish shepherds in local fields. Ordinary working people, the first to hear. 2 authors, 2 communities, 2 theological arguments, 2 paths to the same destination. They were not writing the same story from different angles. They were each writing their own story about the same person toward the same conclusion for their own community's needs. The incompatibilities are not errors. They are evidence of independence. Geza Vermes, a rabbi and professor of Jewish studies at Oxford, the man who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls into English, wrote about this in The Nativity, History and Legend. The 2 accounts, he concluded, cannot be harmonized. Not are difficult to harmonize, cannot be. The same word Brown used, contrary. 2 careful, serious scholars who loved these texts arrived at the same conclusion. Not because they were hostile to the tradition, because they read it the way Spinoza said to read every text, as a human document produced by a human being at a specific moment in human history for a specific human purpose. When you read it that way, the incompatibilities stop being a problem to explain away and start being evidence. Evidence of 2 independent traditions, 2 separate communities, 2 sincere and skilled writers reaching for the same truth by different means. I want to tell you what the nativity scene means to me now. I still see them in December. The carved figures in front of churches, in yards along streets I have driven for decades, the manger, the animals, the shepherd with his staff, the visitors with their gifts, the star fixed above everything. The 10-year gap between Herod's death and Quirinius' census has not closed. The genealogies have not converged. Matthew's family going south into Egypt and Luke's family going directly home to Nazareth remain 2 different answers to the question of what happened after the birth. Those facts have not changed. But I understand now what those figures are saying. I understand what Matthew was trying to say when he built his account around prophecy after prophecy, making sure his community could see, in every step of the story, the long arc of Israel's hope completing itself. And I understand what Luke was trying to say when he set the manger against Caesar's census, the most powerful man in the world issuing decrees about numbers, while in a borrowed corner of a crowded town, something the decree had no category for was quietly happening. These are not reports from journalists at the scene. They are the work of theologians who worked backward from resurrection to birth, writing 80 to 90 years after the events, without eyewitnesses, with prophetic texts they knew intimately, and communities whose needs they understood deeply. There is something, I have sat with this word for a long time, something I can only call dignified about what they did. Dignified and entirely human and desperately sincere. They were not trying to deceive anyone. They were trying to communicate what they believed to be an overwhelming truth, using the only tools available to first-century writers, stories, prophecies, and the narrative traditions their communities already carried. The problem is not the text. The problem is a long habit of reading it as something it was not designed to be. A court record, a census filing, a reporter's notebook from a specific night in a specific year in a specific town. When you read it that way, you are forced either to perform increasingly elaborate gymnastics, to reconcile what cannot be reconciled, or to conclude that someone was lying. Neither of those is the right frame. I still go quiet when I drive past a nativity scene in December. I sit with it for a moment before the light changes. Not because I believe that all those figures were in the same place on the same night. The scholarship I have spent years working through says clearly that they were not, but because I understand what the men who arranged those figures were trying to say. They were saying, whatever this was, it mattered. It mattered enough to reach for your finest language. It mattered enough to stay up through the night arguing about it. It mattered enough to write it down and send it out and ask other people to carry it forward. That impulse, to take something that matters and find a way to say it that will last, I understand that completely.